my ambition here was to create some observer training for our own group, looking at the core modules that we get in the observer handbook. And the first one it starts with is human factors. And so this is how this arises. Now, just a brief introduction. My name is David Reeves, and I'm an observer here in Northampton with a local group. I'm a retired IT consultant. I got made redundant a couple of years ago and then chose to retire and do various things. I immediately trained as an ADI. I thought I'd use some of my skills to do that. Did the training and then decided I didn't really want to do that. But I do look after training of our observers here, as I said. Now, I realized one of the things that we did, although I'm quite happy doing the other modules, in training, we often quite happy doing a car session on corners and bends or something like that. We do tend to completely ignore the human factors one, or I certainly did personally. So what when I came to do this presentation, I thought, let's have another look at that. What do we actually need our observers to know about this? And actually, it sort of changed my view about it somewhat, and where it fits, because I always saw it as kind of standing outside the main training that we do. Now, in doing this, I spent a lot of time on the internet. I also spent a lot of time, as you may have heard somebody say, I have got a private pilot's license, although I've let it lapse in the last couple of years. But if anybody's done any pilot training, one of the things you have to study and you have to pass an exam in is human factors. So I sort of went back to one of my course books and thought, can we lift anything? Is this relevant to driving? And so this is how this arose in what we're doing. So let's take a step back. We all know these sorts of figures. This is a sort of graphic. I looked at some figures about sorts of accidents, and there's a lot of figures out there. This is a study that actually classified things into either human factors, environmental, or mechanical. And no surprises, depending on which figures you look at, somewhere between 85 and 95%, and I think that's conservative, have some sort of human factor in it, any sort of collision, as I should call them. Now, this particular study, as I say, dealt with environmental and mechanical ones, that classified those. Most of the data came from in the late 70s, I think. So when I think about the car I was driving then, the Morris Marina, it was considerably less reliable than the VW I'm driving today. So I suspect the mechanical failure category has shrunk even more. And the environmental, well, you could argue, well, there's not too much we can do about that. But maybe there is. Maybe we just don't go out when it's blowing a gale like today, or when it's snowy or something. But the fact remains, by a very long margin, human factors, human error, if you want to call it that, is the biggest area. If we want to concentrate on road safety and driver safety, which is where we're coming from, then we really need to address human factors. Why do humans get it wrong so many times? And we do. Now, if I look at human, I then, having created this, I wanted to, what is a definition of human factors? And it turns out to be a very big area of study. But it's basically, this was the neatest definition I could find. Human factors is concerned with the understanding and managing the capability and limitations of people. So it's about accepting that we're human beings. We do some things really well and some things really badly, and being able to live with that and manage that in the appropriate environment. So we're all human, we all make mistakes, forget things, our attention span's limited, we overlook key information, we get distracted, bored, tired and preoccupied, we mishear and misunderstand. So we get stuff wrong. Now, as a study, as I've alluded to, a lot of this was originally done in the aviation industry. People started to fly straight after the First World War, and quickly planes got better and more reliable. And there's a sort of realization that, as you said here, it was known very early on in aviation history that pilots fail significantly more than the plane did, which is a nice definition, I thought, from this Australian guy who summed it up. And you could substitute that for driving or riding, I think, as well. Humans often make the same mistakes. So different humans make the same mistakes and they repeat them over and over again. So it stands to reason that if we study those, then we can probably make some improvements. And this is where this comes from. Now, it is a massive field. The more I looked at it, the more I realized that there's an awful lot in there. It goes into ergonomics, how you design vehicles, all sorts of factors. But I want to concentrate on how it affects us in advanced driver training. Apologise for motorbike groups. We happen to be a car group, so I tend to have got all my references with regard to car driving as opposed to motorcycling.
Don't worry, we're not immune to it.
Thank you. So why are humans so accident prone? Now, this is interesting. Even the phrase accident prone apparently was only coined in about 1920. It's sort of about the same stage that driving mechanical vehicles became more popular. As soon as we did it, pretty much, we started killing people and having collisions and so on. So why are we intrinsically so bad at it? Well, one explanation is the bog standard one. You know, depending on which figure you look, we've been evolving as human beings for 6 million years, and for the last 150 or less, we've been driving cars. We're basically not evolved to do it. In fact, I would argue we're not that good at going faster than walking pace. As soon as we start running, we run into things and off things and in under things and so on. And as soon as we got on horses and went faster, we definitely started injuring ourselves. And as soon as we get on with mechanical details, yeah, we do a really good job of it. So we really aren't evolved to do this right now. So humans and driving, what have we got to do? It can't be that difficult. Let's step back, look at the fine detail of it and see where we can make some improvements. What have we got to do? If you are programming an automatic car, or for that matter, a human being, to drive a car, what have you got to do? Well, it should be very simple. We take in information via the senses, sight, sound, smell, etc. And you can consider those to be our sensors. They're the things that are detecting light, sound, smell, whatever. We have to take in those inputs. And of course, they are sensors, so they have operating limits. They need a minimum light level or a maximum light level and things like this at a certain sound level before they will react. We then need to process that information in some way. We need to process it and make a decision. And really, at the end of the day, there's only certain things we can do. We can continue as we are, kind of no decision, if you like. We can steer, decelerate, or accelerate. I think it's very simple. I saw it summed up when I was training as an ADI. I saw somebody else's presentation where he said, basically learning to drive is very simple. There's 2 stages to it. One, learning to accelerate, decelerate, and steer. And phase 2, learning when to do it. And obviously the learning when to do it is where we come in a large degree, finessing that. But it doesn't sound too complicated. You know, put like this, it's not a lot of work. But we're humans. We have a fairly limited information processing abilities. So it's the processing we have to do competes with lots of other things going on in our head. But basically what we need this human computer to do is perception. We need those sensors to detect things in our environment, mainly via vision, but it might be other senses like smell, touch, and so on at the same time. But there's a lot of information coming on. into our brain, some of it relevant, some not. So we've got to attend to it. We've got to pay attention to very specific items on that agenda, as it were. We've effectively got to multitask because there's lots of different things going on. There's what's going on in front of us, behind us, what's already happened. Now, despite what everybody says about men not being able to multitask, actually it's more general. Humans don't really multitask. We do different tasks, one after the other, sequentially, very quickly, some more quickly than others. And it's that switching that we need to learn to do. Now, if we switch our attention from one thing to another, we've got to remember what we were attending to previously, and that's where memory comes in. So let's have a look at this. Our senses will pick up certain information. Our eyes are quite good at seeing straight lines and things like this. So we look at this picture, we see the edge of the bridge, we see it looks like it gets a bit narrow, we can see the edge of the carriageway and so on. It's quite a bright day, very bright light. In fact, the camera hasn't completely captured that because of its own limitations. We're used to certain things. We're used to road surfaces being dark grey and matte coloured. This is a little bit shiny. We can see some ice on it, some lines on it. So we're registering all those things. But due to the brightness, due to the silhouettedness of the trees behind that, we might not see the motorcyclist. Anybody not see the motorcyclist? Because it might be that this is beyond the operating abilities of our eyes. The sheer contrast, the brightness and the darkness, means that they get lost into this picture and our eyes don't register it. Then we've got the idea of attention. Now, in reality, this is the scene. It happens to be in Northampton. It's an everyday scene, driving down this road. But just imagine for a moment, you're setting off. Actually, if we carried on down this road and we're going to turn left in about a quarter of a mile and there's some shops, you're going to go there and you're going to buy something. Let's say, for the sake of argument, it's a fishing rod, and you're not quite sure whether it's going to be the new carbon fibre one, or you can tell I don't know anything about fishing, but you've got some things on your mind. You should be attending to this driving situation. You've clocked there's a car straight ahead, that light blue one. We definitely have to move out to go around that one. Oh, but just up ahead, there's two cars with their brake lights on. So we're going to have to do something about that. That's in my mind as well, because I will have to slow down for those. And there's a taxi pulling out further down, not an immediate danger, but if they stay there, that's going to bring our lane of traffic to a halt. And the more that you look, the more that you can see. So I've got to decide which bit I actually attend to. Where do I place my attention? What about the pedestrian that's kind of just in front of the light blue car on the left? What about the yellow van that seems to be parked with the driver outside the cab further down on the other side of the road? So I've got to have selective attention. I've got to switch it between those things. And obviously, as we teach advanced driving, you've got to think what's behind you. What about all those other stuff? So I've got to switch my attention. I've got to do that multitasking thing. So that's where the memory comes in. I've got to remember it's a 30-mile-an-hour speed limit. Oh, and it's definitely not the next left turning where I'm going to go to my fishing rod shop, because there was a no entry sign. Oh, and I've got to remember what's behind me. Maybe there was a cyclist I've just passed a minute or so ago. If I come to a halt on this road, they're going to catch me up. And so on. So memory is important as well. So this is what we've got to do. This is our kind of processing power. This is what's going on in our brain. Now, this is one diagram I have lifted from my pilot training, which I quite liked. It's a slight diversion, but it's this idea that actually, when we want to make decisions, our brain operates best at an optimum area in the middle. It has to get just the right amount of stimulation. So stimulation is all the other input from these senses, anything at all that's coming into our brain, there is an optimal working zone. So it's things like, and how aroused, how much stimulation we get depends on situational awareness. Am I in this thing? If you're driving the car versus being a passenger, you're much more alert for all of those, that situational awareness and vigilance. Your level of distraction, you know, what else is going on? You thinking about the new fishing rod or something rather than anything else. Your levels of stress, in other words, other things bombarding you at that moment, and where you're choosing your attention. Now, it's interesting that there are suboptimal areas, both to the left when you're under aroused and to the right when you're over aroused with this. Looking at that first one, now if we think about driving down a boring motorway, maybe evening time and there's hardly any traffic and so on, you can see that your brain isn't stimulated to the same degree. We're not getting all of those cues. So that we need to actually up the stimulation. Now, the simple way was just turn the car radio on and start listening to something. Even that will start something and we get a little bit more awake. Better still, we might, with our advanced training, think about things like setting up a proper scan, looking as far as you can see, checking the mirrors every few seconds and things like this to kind of up the level of stimulation that you get. But it's an interesting one, this. The more you look at this, I found loads of information. I had to edit this right back to the bare bones for this presentation. But the idea of habituation, you get used to not getting any information, which is sort of why when the traffic comes to a grinding halt on the motorway, people don't always recognize it straight away because they've got used to just not getting that information. But the main area of interest to us is the other side, on that right-hand side, when suddenly we're getting much more information than we were used to. The situation has changed. We're now in a busy urban environment. There's lots of things to look out for. Or it could still be the motorway scenario, but now up ahead there's been a collision, there are emergency vehicles, there's traffic slowing down, all sorts of things happening. Much more information than we can process in the time. Now this is interesting because what the brain does in this situation of over-arousal is it starts to focus down our attention just onto one area. It's sort of tunnel vision. So we focus down on it and concentrate on just that one thing. Now that's all very well. That serves us in evolutionary terms really well. If we're being attacked by a saber-toothed tiger, we don't want to be thinking about what's for tea tonight. We want to just concentrate on that one hazard. But it doesn't always serve us so well in this situation. Now, coming back to the flying training, one thing that they hammer into you, they say, okay, these are your priorities. Aviate, navigate, communicate. Don't get so wrapped up with the radio that you forget to fly the plane or any of the other things. And I wondered, is there something that we have in driving we can do the same? And it would be, first of all, drive the car. Don't mess with all the other stuff, drive the car safely. And the second thing we do when there's a sudden change in workload in a pilot situation, like, I don't know, some sort of failure, like a failure in the radio or the flaps or something, you reach for your checklist. Rather than do all these things, we say, okay, right, let's focus on this and work through it systematically. Now, I'm not saying we have a printed checklist when we do this, but we do in advanced driving and riding have a checklist. We have IPSCAR. And so in the situation where we're suddenly bombarded with much more information, maybe that's where we should turn to. That's what we look, we have our checklist. One more point on this, because it is fascinating. And I left this, I should have edited it out, but I love this. I loved it for the name as much as anything. The lacuna of indecision. And apparently, so imagine you've gone through suddenly this turmoil going on, that there's been a collision in front of you, the emergency vehicles, all sorts of stuff, and it's been horrendous, and you've dealt with it and whatever. You come out the other side, back to calm, and actually the brain does a shutdown and says, I'm not going to make any more decisions anymore for the time being. and it's quite hard to concentrate on anything. And it's yet another stage to be aware of, a sort of self-awareness that if you've gone through one of these high intensity periods, that's the time you should go to the service station, get a coffee or whatever until things kind of settle down, as much as tiredness and so on. Anyway, back to the plot. I'm positing the idea we do information processing. We've got a fairly basic computer that we're doing all these things, and it requires some mental functions. I said it needed perception so that we know what we're looking, we're able to look at something or hear it or whatever. We need attention, we need to pay attention to those different things, and that involves multitasking. And actually, we need memory. You can't do multitasking without memory. Okay, so far, so good. But we do know all of those things can be degraded, we can be impaired. If you haven't got your glasses, you've got poor eyesight, then you're not going to be able to take in that perception and perceive those things in the first place. If you're ill, if you've taken alcohol, if you've got drugs, they may affect your processing power. And then we've got all the things that compete for your brain's bandwidth. Distractions, mobile phones, passenger, radio, whatever it might be. But then there's the more subtle ones, long-term stress, work, relationships. If the conversation with your boss that you had yesterday keeps coming back into your mind, unbidden, and is taking up some of your brain space, that's brain space that's not available for the driving task. It's competing with it. And then there's all the short-term stresses. The car's too hot, too cold, you're late for work, that's on your mind. You're a bit uncomfortable, you should have adjusted the car seat but didn't, and now it's a bit uncomfortable. And of course, traffic and road situations that all add to that stress, and therefore all of those things that your mind is working on, and so impairing that processing power. Obviously, we can do some things about that. First of all, we can remove the cause, put our glasses on, don't take drugs, alcohol, or anything that might impair us. If we can't do that, if we can't remove the cause, we remove ourselves, just don't drive. Some of the other things, the long-term stresses, the short-term stresses, we can do things about. At the very least, we have to become more self-aware that they're happening. And then we can consider that and help limit our processing and so on of those, and be aware of it. So self-awareness becomes quite important. So that's all very well, all good stuff. But what about when humans get it wrong? What if they do collide with things, other road users or the scenery or whatever? Now, I love this. I stole this from somebody's study on the internet, and it broke it down into some really neat categories, very, very neat categories that go along with what we've said so far in terms of things like sensors. So why do humans get it wrong? Well, they actually didn't see the hazard. And I'm not talking about fail to observe. I'm saying you physically couldn't see it. And maybe the light was too dim. Our eyes only work in a certain level of light. It just was impossible to see it. It could be too high, too much glare, but our eyes were just not capable of seeing what they needed to see. And that goes along for some other things as well, like it could be the tightness of a bend or the relative speed of a car, because we're not actually that good at judging those things. So that's one category. Next category is subtly different, is that our eyes could collect that information, our senses heard it, saw it, whatever, but the driver failed to register it. They weren't able to pay attention to it. So presumably their mental attention was doing something else. It was focused elsewhere. And I know there's one or two people out there, ex-policemen and so on, I'm sure you've heard of it. I just didn't see the car, the bike, the pedestrian, whatever it was. But hang on, they were wearing a high-vis jacket, they had their headlight. Something was going on that meant they were concentrating elsewhere. And finally, And I've got, you know, 2 lines there, but this is a biggie, and I haven't got the space in this presentation to go into all of these in the fullest of detail. But they correctly processed the information. They saw the other car, the other pedestrian, whatever it was, but then failed to make the correct response. They made a poor decision or no decision at all. Now, we can do some things about this. This is where we come in, as I see it. All of these can be improved with advanced driver training and practice. Let's take the first one. You can't actually see the hazard. Well, if we do things like limit point analysis, we'll give you a technique to judge how tight the bend is. If you do linked observation, or those kind of predictive things, what could we reasonably expect to happen? Well, we can get the idea that there's a hazard before our senses have actually seen it, have actually sensed it. Before we see what's beyond the bend, we're recognizing that that is a hazard. We're being able to register that fact before we actually sense it. What about the next one? Critical information was detectable, but the driver felt it. Better observation. Having a systematic approach, taking, using and giving the information. Let's consider it properly and systematically, and then hopefully we will spot the car, bike, pedestrian, whatever it is. And then the biggie, making the correct decision. Better ordinary driving decisions, but also recognizing when you haven't got enough information to make the decision. And that comes down to kind of self-monitoring and realizing what decisions you are actually making, not just reacting, but actually making decisions and monitoring whether you have the correct information to do it. So let's think about our training a bit, the sort of things we do. We graft on new skills. We do that prediction skills. What can we reasonably expect to happen? Better observation, really looking, really using the information and so on, feeding into better decision making, and of course a certain amount of, I'll call it physical controls, but not crossing your hands on the wheel, gentle steering, feathering the brakes. All of those things help, but not as much as I think as some of the key ones, those new skills. But this is what we're really doing. What we really need in order to do that is a change of mental attitude, a desire and willingness to improve. So you've got, in order to do that, you've got to have that self-evaluation skill to kind of make that all work. Without those things, it doesn't work. And what that gives you is an increased awareness of all those external things, the stresses, what's going on in the world, how you're making those decisions. So, all of those slides, and I've taken up nearly my time, were going to be just an introduction to what it says in the Observer's Handbook. And this has turned out to be the minor point, but it has one page called The Driver, and it says, put safety first in all driving judgments. Okay, yeah, that's about attitude. We've talked about that. Remains calm and considerate of others at all times. I think this is 2 parts here. We often say kind and considerate. It doesn't say kind and considerate, it says calm and considerate. Calm, we're approaching it in a business-like way to keep us in that green zone. Considerate, we are considering what's going on. That's the key word, I think, in this one. We are trying to think about processing that information. Always maintains concentration while driving. This is making sure we attend to the things that we need to attend to and not the others. Manages any external influences and distraction. Yep, let's keep ourselves in that green zone. If the radio has now become a distraction, turn it off. Ask our passenger to be quiet, put the phone away, all of those sorts of things. Changes their plan if factor is likely to impair their performance and decision making. Yeah, it's that awareness of what's going on externally and so on, allowing us to process that. And self-awareness, consistently evaluates their own performance with a view to retaining and developing their skills, and applies that newfound knowledge. So that frames up quite nicely with what we've said so far, I think. Now, the Observer Handbook then has some stuff about the vehicle itself, which I suppose, strictly speaking, isn't a human factor, but nevertheless, it's stuff that we need to cover. So I'm not going to go through this in any detail. It's part of it, but it's mainly about mechanical failures, essentially, checking the car over, checking the vehicle over, and so on, but also making sure you're aware where everything is and how it works. All good stuff, probably not, strictly speaking, a human factor in its entirety anyway. And finally, there are two different pages, and there's not too much said about it, but it talks about the journey. So understands the purpose of the journey and time available may influence their driving decisions. Yeah, this is about keeping us in that green zone of not being overstressed by anything, by thinking about it. Will it get us there on time? Are there any other influences that are going to overload me in that choice of a route? But the interesting one, I think, which I'm not going to cover in any detail at all, is the wider world. Where do we get that picture from? What's our range of influences? Now, when I started this presentation, I really thought about it in terms of, oh yes, it's all about driver attitude. Are you a boy racer or are you the Sunday driver? Where are you on that spectrum? It is those things, but it's, as we've seen, it's much bigger than that. But that is one of the things we need to consider, and that's where that fits, I think. And understanding how your attitude to risk affects driving choices. So that's what it says we as observers need. So I've pretty much come to that. I'm slightly 5 minutes over already. What I'm going to do is just a brief summary. Collisions are actually caused by humans. There's very few cars crash into themselves without there being a human involved. And we're just not evolved to drive yet. I was thinking about this morning, if there are enough collisions, surely eventually only good drivers are left. But it's a bit like herd immunity. I don't think this is a strategy that we would adopt politically. Now, since we're not evolved, I reckon, to go above walking pace, we could reenact, what is it, the Locomotive Act of 1865, which said that you're not allowed to drive more than 10 miles an hour. Obviously, that's outrageous speed, 5 miles an hour in built-up areas. Or we need more training, and that's really where we come in. Now, we know all that. Those are kind of given. But the more I've looked at it, the more I think that the most effective parts, and by effective I mean the most likely to reduce collisions, are the parts of the advanced driver training that relate to human factors, that make it easier for us to make decisions. And far from where my starting point was, this is a module that sits on its own, I think it allows us to frame all the other skills that we cover in advanced driving. On that note, I'm going to stop there and open it up for discussion. And so, by all means, any questions, any thoughts? I realise we've got quite a number of people from other groups, and are really, some of them quite experienced, I dare say, so I'm very keen to hear.